The air was thick with tension, and the wild barking of dogs echoed across the quiet street. Malik Johnson, a 15-year-old black teenager, pressed himself against the cold metal fence, his heart pounding like thunder. He had been walking home, minding his own business, but now two police officers stood in front of him, their hands on leashes, holding back snarling, wild-eyed dogs that looked like they had been unleashed straight out of a nightmare. Malik's breaths came quick and shallow as the dogs lunged toward him, held back only by the officers' tight grip on the leashes. The officers shouted things he could barely understand, words full of anger and accusation. Malik hadn't done anything wrong, but they didn't seem to care. "You thought you could just walk around like you owned the place, huh?" One officer sneered, as if Malik's very existence was an offense. Then, without warning, the officers released the dogs. They let go of the leashes, and the dogs charged forward, teeth bared, aiming straight for Malik. He closed his eyes, bracing himself, feeling the hot rush of terror shoot through his veins. "Stop!" A voice boomed down the street, powerful, angry, and unmistakable. Malik's eyes flew open just in time to see the officers freeze, looking back in shock. Standing there, a commanding figure with a badge glinting in the light, was Malik's father. But this wasn't just his dad, it was their new police chief, the man they were supposed to answer to. The officers' faces drained of color as they realized their terrible mistake. They'd just set wild dogs on the son of their new chief. Hours earlier, Malik had been having an ordinary day, one that had started with a simple errand. His father, whom he called Dad, had just taken on the role of police chief in a precinct notorious for its old ways. It was something the family had been proud of, though there were whispers in the community about whether it was safe, about whether the officers would actually respect his dad. But his father had assured everyone that he was going to change things, make them better. "Malik," his dad had said that morning, "stick around the neighborhood today. I'll be busy, and I don't want you far away." Malik had rolled his eyes but agreed. He understood his dad was a little on edge, adjusting to a role like this, knowing he was in charge of men who may not have welcomed him. Malik felt proud of his dad, who had spent his life fighting for justice. But today was supposed to be just a day like any other, nothing to worry about. Or so he thought. On his way home from the corner store, Malik had noticed a patrol car tailing him slowly, keeping its distance. At first, he figured they were just keeping an eye on things. After all, it was their job to patrol the streets. But as the car got closer, he felt his stomach twist. The officers inside gave him a look that was anything but friendly. The patrol car's engine rumbled as it slowed down, and Malik felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Trying to shake off his nerves, he walked a little faster, hoping they'd just drive past him. But instead the car rolled to a stop, and the officers stepped out, fixing him with hard, suspicious eyes. "Hey kid," one of them shouted. Malik stopped, his heart thudding as he turned to face them. He tried to stay calm, remembering everything his dad had taught him about dealing with the police. "Yes, sir," he replied, keeping his tone respectful. "What are you doing around here?" The second officer demanded, his voice gruff. His hand rested on his hip, near his belt where his baton and handcuffs dangled. Malik's mind raced. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he'd heard enough stories to know that wasn't always what mattered. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "I'm just walking home from the store, sir." The first officer laughed, a low, mean sound. "Walking home, huh?" With an attitude like that, he shot Malik a dark look, like he didn't believe him or didn't care. The other officer took a step forward, his hand tightening around the leash of the dog by his side. Malik's pulse quickened as he noticed the dog, a powerful-looking German shepherd that strained against the leash, barking and snapping. The second officer let out a cruel smirk. "Maybe a little scare will teach you some respect." He wasn't sure if they were serious or just trying to frighten him. Either way, fear began to creep into his mind. His dad had warned him to be careful, especially now that he was chief and some officers might have a chip on their shoulder about it. Malik had promised him he'd be smart, keep his head down. But right now, he wasn't sure what he could do. He took a step back, glancing down the empty street, but there was no one around to see what was happening. "What's the matter, scared?" The first officer taunted, his fingers brushing the leash of his own dog. Malik forced himself to stay calm, taking another deep breath as he weighed his options. But before he could speak, the officers exchanged a quick look, something dark flashing between them. Then, without warning, they unclipped the leashes. The two dogs lunged forward, barking wildly, their teeth bared, aiming right at him. Malik barely had time to move before the snarling animals closed the distance between them. He stumbled back, his hands flying up in a desperate attempt to shield himself, but he knew he didn't stand a chance against those powerful jaws. The dogs growled, snapping at his feet, then at his hands, inches away from biting him. Malik's heart pounded so hard it was almost painful. He didn't know what to do, or if he could even get away. But as the dogs lunged again, he heard a voice, a deep booming voice that cut through the chaos. "Stop," his dad's voice. Earlier that day, Malik's father, Chief Johnson, had gone to work with a heavy heart, knowing he would be stepping into a precinct where his authority might be questioned. He had spent years working his way up, standing out as a fair and dedicated officer. But this position was different. It wasn't just any precinct. It was one that had a history of mistrust with the community, especially the black community. He'd been briefed on the reputation of some officers who believed they ran the streets however they liked, without accountability. Chief Johnson had made it his mission to change that, to bring fairness and safety back to every corner of the city. As he'd left for work, he'd looked at Malik and given him a serious nod. "Remember, son," he'd said, "you stay close to home today, all right? No wandering off." Malik had nodded, barely paying attention as he fiddled with his phone. He didn't understand why his dad was so worried. But Chief Johnson knew too well the tension brewing beneath the surface of his new role. There were officers who would test his authority, officers who might not care who his family was. After settling into his new office that morning, he'd spent hours meeting with officers, some friendly, others noticeably stiff and distant. But every time he'd mentioned his plan to change how they patrolled certain neighborhoods, the room seemed to grow quieter, and more than one officer exchanged wary glances. Then, just before he'd heard about Malik's incident, Chief Johnson had received a call. A neighbor down the street had seen Malik being followed by a patrol car. He had barely processed this before another call came in, a report about an incident involving 2 officers and a civilian near his neighborhood. Without thinking, he'd grabbed his car keys, ignoring the confused stares from the other officers, and raced out of the station. He had arrived just in time to see the horrifying sight, his son cornered, terrified, with 2 snarling dogs ready to attack. The officers stood a few steps back, their faces twisted with a strange satisfaction. They hadn't noticed him yet, too absorbed in their twisted game. When he'd shouted, the officers had finally turned, their smug expressions replaced with shock. They stiffened as they realized who he was. Malik's father stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, calm, but with an edge that made both officers flinch. They looked from Malik to Chief Johnson, panic creeping into their eyes. The dogs sensed their handler's tension and backed off, whining as they retreated. Malik staggered back, barely able to believe that his dad was really there. The officers stammered, trying to explain, but Chief Johnson held up a hand, silencing them. "I don't want to hear a single word from either of you," he said coldly. "There will be consequences for this." He turned to Malik, his face softening slightly. "Are you all right, son?" Malik nodded, though he was still shaken. His dad put a reassuring hand on his shoulder before turning back to the officers. "You two," he said, his voice ice-cold, "are coming with me to the station. I want a full explanation." The officers exchanged a glance, panic in their eyes. They knew that they'd crossed a line that might end their careers or worse. But Chief Johnson wasn't finished yet. He glanced around at the empty street, his gaze hardening as he looked back at them. "You think you can do whatever you want," he said, his voice low. "But this ends now. I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned on his heel, motioning for Malik to follow him. Malik fell into step beside his father, feeling a surge of relief mixed with a sense of pride in his dad's strength. But as they walked, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that there were deeper, darker problems in his father's precinct, problems that might not be so easy to fix. Just as they reached the edge of the block, a loud shout came from behind them. Malik and his father turned to see one of the officers reaching for something on his belt. The next chapter of their battle had just begun. The officer's hand moved quickly, reaching for his radio. Chief Johnson narrowed his eyes, watching the officer's every move, alert for any sign of trouble. Malik stood close to his father, trying to stay calm as his heart raced. He could see the officer's face, twisted in a mixture of defiance and fear. "Sir, I can explain," the officer finally blurted, his voice trembling. "We thought the kid was, we thought he was acting suspicious." Chief Johnson's jaw clenched. Acting suspicious? By walking home from the store? The second officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his eyes darting nervously between Malik and Chief Johnson. "Chief, please, we had no idea he was, you know your son." He swallowed hard, realizing that his words only made the situation worse. Does it matter whose son he is? Chief Johnson's voice was dangerously low, his anger controlled but fierce. You unleashed dogs on an unarmed teenager without a shred of evidence. My son or not, what you did is inexcusable. The officers stood, caught between shame and defensiveness. It was clear they hadn't expected any consequences, at least not like this. But Chief Johnson wasn't backing down. He reached for his phone, dialing a number with a calm determination that sent a chill down Malik's spine. "Dispatch, this is Chief Johnson," he said into the phone, his voice steady. "I'm bringing 2 officers in for immediate suspension pending investigation. Have the captain meet me in my office." The officers went pale. Chief Johnson pocketed his phone and turned to them, gesturing for them to get into their car. "You'll follow me back to the station. Now." They hesitated, their pride battling with the understanding that they had no choice. Malik could see the anger and humiliation brewing in their faces, but they didn't dare argue. With a quick glance at each other, they moved to their patrol car, climbing in without another word. As Chief Johnson led Malik to his own car, he finally let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging. Malik could tell how hard his father was trying to keep his anger under control. He hadn't seen his dad like this before, so tense, so close to losing his cool. They drove in silence, Malik watching his dad's face, trying to read his expression. He went to say something, to ask what was going to happen next, but he could tell his dad wasn't ready to talk yet. Instead, he stared out the window, his mind replaying the terrifying events over and over, the image of those snarling dogs seared into his memory. When they reached the station, Chief Johnson parked, then motioned for Malik to stay in the car. "I'll be back soon," he said, his voice softer, but still laced with tension. Malik nodded, watching as his dad walked into the building, followed by the 2 officers, their heads down, their expressions dark. As the minutes ticked by, Malik's mind raced. He thought about the officers' faces, the way they had looked at him with so much anger and contempt. He had heard stories like this from friends and family, stories about run-ins with cops who saw them as trouble, just because of the color of their skin. But he had never imagined it would happen to him, especially not with his father as the new chief. Eventually, Chief Johnson returned, his expression unreadable. He opened the car door, sitting down beside Malik, letting out a long, slow breath. Malik waited, not daring to interrupt the silence. After a few moments, his dad spoke. "Malik," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happened today should never have happened. And I promise you, I won't let it happen again." Malik nodded, unsure of what to say. He could see the weight of responsibility in his father's eyes, the burden of his new role pressing down on him. Chief Johnson looked at his son, his gaze steady. "Those officers are on suspension," he said. "They'll be investigated, and if I have anything to say about it, they won't be patrolling these streets anymore. But I need you to understand something." Malik listened, his heart pounding as his father continued. "This job, it's more complicated than I ever thought it would be. There are men in this precinct who don't want things to change. And after today, I know they'll do whatever it takes to make sure I don't succeed." Malik swallowed, a mixture of fear and anger bubbling up inside him. "But they'd work for you, right? You're the chief." His father gave a sad smile. "That's what makes it harder. Some of them have been here a long time. They're used to doing things their way, and they won't change easily. They see me as an outsider, someone who's going to take away their power." Malik looked down, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew his dad was under a lot of pressure, but he hadn't realized just how deep the problems went. "I'm sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to cause trouble." Chief Johnson shook his head, placing a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. "This isn't your fault, son. None of this is your fault. I just need you to be careful. Promise me that if anything like this happens again, you'll call me immediately." Malik nodded, his heart heavy. "I promise." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the day pressing down on them both. But as they prepared to drive home, Chief Johnson's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from exhaustion to concern. "It's the captain," he murmured, answering the call. "Yes, I'm with my son." "What? Now?" Malik watched as his dad's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he listened. After a tense few moments, Chief Johnson ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Dad?" Malik asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's wrong?" His father looked at him, his expression filled with a strange mix of frustration and sadness. "They want me back at the station," he said, his voice hollow. "Apparently, some of the other officers are unhappy about the suspensions. There's been a complaint filed against me already. Malik's eyes widened. A complaint? Against you. But you did the right thing. Chief Johnson gave a weary nod. Some people don't see it that way. They think I'm overstepping my bounds, that I'm being too hard on them. Malik felt a surge of anger. But they're the ones who were wrong. They hurt people for no reason. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze steady. I know, son, I know. But change doesn't come easy, especially not in places like this. And right now, it looks like we're going to have to fight for every inch. They sat in silence, the reality of his father's words sinking in. Malik felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. He knew his dad was strong, knew he was willing to stand up for what was right. But he also knew that standing up to people who didn't want change was a dangerous thing. And as he looked at his father, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was only beginning. "Let's go home," Chief Johnson said softly, finally starting the car. But just as they pulled out of the station parking lot, Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, his heart skipping a beat, as he saw a message from a friend. "Malik," the message read, "did you hear? Some officers are mad about your dad. They're saying they're going to get even." Malik's heart sank. He looked at his dad, a sense of dread building inside him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had a sinking feeling that this fight was far from over. Malik's hands shook as he read the message over and over, trying to make sense of it. His friend had heard rumors that some officers were angry enough to want revenge. Malik's stomach churned, and he felt a rush of fear that he hadn't felt before, even when those dogs had been snarling inches from his face. This was different. This was something that could reach beyond just him. It could come for his father and his family. He took a shaky breath and looked over at his dad, who was focused on the road, his jaw clenched tight. Chief Johnson seemed calm, but Malik could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. His dad was in the fight of his life, and he didn't even know just how serious it was. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, Malik's father glanced at him and noticed his uneasy expression. "Something on your mind, son?" Chief Johnson asked, his voice softer now. All the authority from earlier faded into the concern of a father. Malik hesitated, his fingers still gripping his phone. He wanted to tell his dad, to let him know what he had just read, but he could already see the weight his father was carrying. If he told him about the message, it would only add to that burden. But this wasn't something he could keep to himself either. "Dad," he started, his voice wavering, I got a text from a friend. They said some officers are mad about what happened today. They're saying they want to get even." Chief Johnson's face tightened, a flicker of fear flashing across his eyes, but he quickly hid it. He looked away, focusing on the quiet street outside, his gaze intense. "Malik," he said after a long silence, "this job isn't easy. There are people who don't like change, people who will do anything to keep things the way they are, even if it means hurting others." Malik's chest felt heavy. "But Dad, what if they try to hurt you?" Chief Johnson looked back at him, his face softening. He reached over, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Don't worry about me, son. I can handle myself. But I need you to promise me something. I need you to stay safe. Stay out of this. Don't let anyone try to drag you into the middle of it." Malik nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he could make that promise. He felt helpless, like everything was spiraling out of control. His father was facing threats from his own officers, and all Malik could do was stand by and watch. They stepped out of the car and walked into the house. The familiar warmth of home felt strangely hollow, like something had shifted, something Malik couldn't quite explain. His mother, Sarah, was in the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared dinner, unaware of the turmoil brewing around her family. When she turned around and saw them, her face lit up in a smile, but it faded when she saw the serious expressions on their faces. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her gaze darting between them. Chief Johnson forced a smile, trying to ease the tension. "It's been a long day, that's all," he replied, his voice light, but Malik could hear the strain beneath it. Sarah looked at them, sensing that there was more to the story, but she didn't press further. Instead, she walked over to Malik, giving him a reassuring hug. "How about we all sit down and have dinner? I made your favorite, Malik, fried chicken and mashed potatoes." Malik managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." They sat down to eat, and for a brief moment, it felt like things were normal again. They talked about school, about Malik's basketball team, about all the little things that made up their lives. But the tension lingered, like a shadow hanging over them. After dinner, Malik retreated to his room, trying to distract himself with his favorite video games, but he couldn't shake the nagging worry in the back of his mind. Every time he thought about what had happened with the dogs, about the officers' faces as they looked at him with contempt, a chill ran down his spine. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The night was quiet, but Malik's mind raced, replaying the events of the day over and over. Just as he started to drift off, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, his heart racing as he saw another message from his friend. "Malik, you need to be careful. I heard some of the officers talking outside the station. They're saying your dad's on borrowed time, that he's too soft to be chief. One of them even said he needs to be taught a lesson." Malik's breath itched, his fingers trembling as he read the words. He felt anger bubble up inside him. How could they say that about his father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting? The man he looked up to more than anyone else. But as much as he wanted to march down to that station and confront those officers himself, he knew he couldn't. His dad had warned him to stay out of it, to let him handle it. But the thought of his father going into that station every day, facing officers who wanted him gone, or worse, was almost unbearable. The next day, Malik woke up early, still tired from the restless night. He was quiet during breakfast, barely able to look at his dad as he prepared to leave for work. Chief Johnson noticed the change in him, but he didn't press the issue, giving Malik a reassuring nod before heading out the door. As soon as he was gone, Malik turned to his mom. "Mom, do you think Dad's going to be okay?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes sad but full of determination. "Your father is strong, Malik. He's been through a lot. But we have to trust him to handle this, even if it's hard." Malik nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. That afternoon after school, he went to the basketball court to clear his head. He practiced his shots, letting the sound of the bouncing ball drown out his worries. But as he dribbled, he felt a pair of eyes on him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw two men standing near the edge of the court, dressed in plain clothes, but with a certain hardness in their expressions that told him they were officers. They watched him, their gazes cold and assessing, and a chill ran down his spine. Malik pretended not to notice them, focusing on his game, but he couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on him. After a few minutes, they turned and walked away, but the uneasy feeling lingered. He felt exposed, like he was being watched, like they were keeping tabs on him. That night, he told his father about the men he had seen at the basketball court. Chief Johnson's face hardened, his expression tense as he listened. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said quietly. "They're trying to get to me through you." Malik felt a wave of anger rise within him. Why can't you just fire them? Get rid of them. His father looked at him, a sad smile on his face. "It's not that easy, Malik. There are rules, processes. I can't just remove someone without cause. And if they feel threatened, they're going to push back harder." The frustration in Malik's chest grew. So he just wait around, hoping they don't do something worse. Chief Johnson placed a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. "No, we don't wait. We keep going, we stay strong, and we don't let them intimidate us. They want us to be scared to back down, but we can't give them that satisfaction." Malik nodded, though he wasn't sure he felt any less afraid. He wanted to believe his dad, to trust that things would get better. But deep down, he knew that the fight was only beginning, and he wasn't sure what it would cost them. Later that night, a loud crash shattered the silence of their home. Malik bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. He heard his parents' voices, hushed but tense, as they moved through the house, checking the doors and windows. Peering out of his room, Malik saw his father examining something on the front porch. The glass pane on the door was shattered, and lying on the floor was a brick, wrapped with a crumpled note. Chief Johnson picked up the note, reading it with a stony expression. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale with worry. Malik crept closer, catching a glimpse of the words scrawled on the paper in bold, angry handwriting. "Back off, Chief, or next time won't just be a warning." Chief Johnson's face was grim as he crumpled the note in his fist. Malik's heart pounded as he watched his father, a mixture of fear and anger twisting in his chest. This wasn't just a warning. This was a threat, a promise that the battle was far from over. And in that moment, Malik knew that their family was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that might change their lives forever. The night passed in an uneasy silence, each member of the family retreating to their rooms, but no one slept much. Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the threat hanging heavy over him. The broken glass and the chilling note felt like more than just a warning. They were a promise that things would only get worse. In the morning, the atmosphere at home was tense. Malik's father was quiet, lost in his thoughts, while his mother moved around the kitchen with a nervous energy, trying to keep herself busy. Malik felt the unspoken worry between them. each of them wondering if something worse was around the corner. After breakfast, Malik's father spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We need to be more cautious," he said, looking at both Malik and his wife, Sarah. "This isn't going away on its own. There's a good chance things will get tougher before they get better. But I need you both to trust me. I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe." Malik nodded, though he wasn't entirely reassured. His dad had always been his hero, the person he looked up to and trusted most. But now, seeing the lines of worry etched into his father's face, he realized just how much pressure his dad was under. The people who should have been his father's allies were turning against him, and Malik couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in danger. After school that day, Malik walked home, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be watching him. Every passing car, every stranger on the sidewalk made him uneasy. The weight of the fear was almost overwhelming, but he tried to shake it off, reminding himself of his dad's words. "Stay strong, don't let them intimidate you." But as he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a familiar car parked nearby. It was the same car he'd seen the day before near the basketball court, the two plainclothes officers sitting inside, watching him. Malik's heart raced, but he forced himself to keep walking, pretending not to notice them. When he reached his house, he quickly shut the door behind him, breathing heavily. His mother looked up from the kitchen, concern flashing in her eyes. "Everything okay, Malik?" He nodded, not wanting to worry her. "Yeah, Mom? Just long day." But as he went up to his room, he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The men were watching him, and he had a feeling they were just waiting for the right moment to do something worse. Malik decided that he needed to tell his dad, even if it meant adding to his father's worries. That evening, when his father returned from work, Malik waited until after dinner to bring it up. He approached his dad cautiously, choosing his words carefully. "Dad, I think some of those officers are following me." Chief Johnson stopped, his face tightening. "What did you think that?" Malik took a deep breath, explaining what he'd seen near the basketball court and again on his way home. His father listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. "They're trying to scare you?" Chief Johnson said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "They think they can get to me by threatening you, but that's not going to happen. I won't let them hurt you, Malik." Malik nodded, feeling a flicker of relief, but he could see the tension in his father's face. Chief Johnson wasn't just dealing with a few rogue officers. He was dealing with a system that was resisting his every move, and it was clear that the people within that system would go to any lengths to keep things the way they were. A few days later, the tension reached a breaking point. It was late in the afternoon, and Malik was sitting in his room, working on his homework, when he heard a loud bang outside. He jumped up, his heart pounding, and rushed to the window, peering out into the street. A patrol car had pulled up in front of their house, and two officers were stepping out. Malik recognized one of them. It was Officer Grant, one of the men who had unleashed the dogs on him that terrible day. The sight of him made Malik's skin crawl, memories flooding back in a rush of fear and anger. Malik's father stepped outside, facing the officers, his posture calm but tense. Malik couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the anger in the officers' faces, their voices raised as they confronted his dad. Malik's mother appeared beside him, watching anxiously from the window, her hands gripping the windowsill tightly. The argument grew louder, and Malik could finally make out snippets of their conversation. The officers were accusing Chief Johnson of overstepping his authority, of bringing unwanted changes to the precinct. They claimed that he was disrupting the natural order and undermining their work. Chief Johnson stood his ground, his voice steady. "My job is to serve this community, to ensure that every citizen is treated with respect and fairness. If you have a problem with that, then maybe you're the ones who don't belong here." The officers bristled at his words, their faces twisting in anger. "You don't belong here," one of them spat. "You think you can come in and change everything, make us look like we're the problem. But you're the outsider, Johnson. People around here don't want you." Chief Johnson's face remained calm, but Malik could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "If you're so sure about that," he said quietly, "then maybe it's time for you to find a different place to work. Because as long as I'm chief, things are going to change, and anyone who can't handle that is free to leave." The officers exchanged a dark look, their anger barely contained. Without another word, they turned and stalked back to their patrol car, their faces filled with hatred. As they drove away, Malik felt a chill run down his spine. The confrontation had only confirmed what he already knew. These officers weren't going to back down. They were going to fight his father at every turn, and they weren't afraid to play dirty. Later that night, as the family sat together in the living room, Malik couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. His father tried to reassure them, but Malik could see the worry in his mother's eyes, the way she glanced at the windows as if expecting someone to be watching them. Then, just as the tension began to fade, a loud noise shattered the quiet. The unmistakable sound of glass breaking echoed through the house. Malik's heart leaped as he jumped to his feet, his mind racing. Chief Johnson moved quickly, grabbing a flashlight and signaling for everyone to stay back. Malik watched, fear gripping him as his father approached the shattered window in the living room. A small object lay on the floor, surrounded by shards of broken glass. His father picked it up, examining it carefully. It was another brick, wrapped in a piece of paper with a message scrawled in angry, jagged handwriting. "This is your last warning. Step down or your family will pay the price." Chief Johnson's face hardened as he read the message. Malik's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the brick, the threat sinking in. Malik's father turned to them, his expression fierce. "They're trying to scare us, trying to force me to back down," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "But I'm not going to let them win. I'm not going to let them drive us out of our own home." Malik felt a surge of pride at his father's words, but he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at him. These people were serious. They were willing to do whatever it took to protect their power, even if it meant targeting innocent people. The night was restless, each of them too tense to sleep. Malik lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, wondering how much longer they could hold out. His father was strong, determined to make things right, but Malik knew that he couldn't fight this battle alone. The next morning, Chief Johnson gathered the family in the living room, his face serious. "I've decided it's time to take this to the public," he said. "If these officers are willing to threaten us like this, then the people in this community deserve to know. I'm going to hold a press conference and expose what's been happening." Malik's eyes widened. He knew his father was brave, but this was a risky move. Going public would put them under even more scrutiny, and there was no telling how the officers would react. But Malik also knew that his father was right. Staying silent would only allow these men to continue their campaign of intimidation unchecked. As the day wore on, Chief Johnson prepared his statement, contacting reporters and setting up the press conference for the following morning. Malik could feel the tension mounting, a sense of anticipation building as they waited for the inevitable backlash. But that night, just as they were preparing to go to bed, another loud crash echoed through the house. Malik's heart raced as he bolted from his room, meeting his parents in the hallway. They exchanged fearful looks, the sound still ringing in their ears. Rushing to the front door, they found a new message spray-painted across their garage door in bright red letters. "Quite now," or "Roy." Malik stared at the words, a mix of fear and anger churning within him. The threat was clear, unmistakable. But as he looked at his father, standing tall and resolute in the face of this latest act of intimidation, he felt a spark of courage ignite within him. No matter what it took, he knew they would face this fight together. The next morning, Chief Johnson rose early, his eyes tired but determined. He went through his notes, revising his speech for the press conference, a statement he hoped would shed light on the dark forces, resisting his efforts to bring justice and fairness to the police force. Malik watched his father prepare, a mixture of pride and fear filling his heart. His dad was taking a stand against people who held powerful positions, people who were willing to use threats and intimidation to keep control. It was a brave move, but Malik couldn't ignore the nagging worry that it could make things even more dangerous for their family. As the family got ready to leave for the press conference, they found that word had spread quickly. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers stood outside their house, offering quiet support. Some gave nods of encouragement, others murmured words of sympathy, hoping for change. The show of support was heartening, but Malik could see the fear in their eyes too. The community was on edge, holding its breath for what was about to happen. At the city hall, the crowd was even larger. News crews had gathered, reporters set up with cameras, and curious residents watched closely, eager to hear what the new chief had to say. Malik stayed close to his mother, scanning the crowd nervously, wondering if any of his dad's enemies were hidden among the faces. Finally, Chief Johnson stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat as he looked over the crowd. The chatter quieted and all eyes turned to him. He began by thanking the people for their support, then spoke of his commitment to the community, of his lifelong dedication to justice. He described the resistance he'd faced since taking on the role of chief, choosing his words carefully, revealing enough to hint at the threats he and his family had endured, but holding back the most personal details. "As a community, "We deserve a police force that serves all people with integrity and respect," Chief Johnson said, his voice strong. "But there are those who would rather see us divided, who resist change at all costs, who are willing to resort to fear and intimidation. I'm here to tell you that I will not back down. Together we can build a safer, fairer city." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers rising up as the people showed their support. Malik felt a surge of pride, his father standing tall, defying the men who wanted to silence him. But even as the crowd cheered, Malik noticed a few figures in the back, their expressions hard, arms crossed, their eyes fixed on Chief Johnson with icy glares. Just as his father finished his speech, a reporter raised her hand, shouting out a question. "Chief Johnson, there are rumors that members of your own force have made threats against you. Can you confirm or deny this?" The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Chief Johnson, waiting for his response. He took a deep breath, his face solemn. "Unfortunately, yes, there have been attempts to intimidate me and my family. But I want to be clear, I took an oath to protect this community, and I take that responsibility seriously. No amount of intimidation will stop me from doing my job." The crowd murmured, shock and sympathy spreading through the gathered faces. But among them, Malik could see those same stone-faced figures, watching with a cold, calculating gaze. After the press conference, as the crowd began to disperse, Malik and his family made their way back to the car. But before they could get in, a voice called out, stopping them in their tracks. "Hey, Chief Johnson." It was Officer Grant, the same officer who had unleashed the dogs on Malik. He approached with a group of officers, each of them wearing matching expressions of resentment. Malik's heart pounded as he watched his dad turn to face them, his posture calm but wary. "Grant," Chief Johnson greeted him, his voice cool. "Is there something you need?" Grant smirked, crossing his arms. "I just wanted to congratulate you on that speech, Chief. Very inspiring." His voice dripped with sarcasm, and Malik felt a surge of anger, remembering the terror he'd felt with those snarling dogs inches from him. Chief Johnson didn't take the bait, keeping his expression steady. "If you have something to say, Grant, say it. Otherwise, I have work to do." Grant's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You don't belong here, Johnson," he said quietly, his voice hard. "People around here aren't interested in your ideas of reform and justice. You're an outsider, trying to change things that don't need changing." Chief Johnson stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because the people in this community deserve better. And if that makes me an outsider in your eyes, so be it. But I won't let fear or intimidation stand in the way of doing what's right." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick in the air. Malik could feel his heart racing, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to step in, to defend his father, but he knew he had to let his dad handle this. Finally, Grant stepped back, a sneer on his face. "We'll see how long you last, Chief. People like you don't usually make it too far around here." With that, he turned and walked away, his group of officers following him, each of them casting hostile glances at Chief Johnson as they passed. Malik and his family returned home, shaken but resolute. Chief Johnson had made his stand, and now it was clear that the resistance he faced was only growing stronger. They were in for a fight, and the stakes had just been raised. That night, Malik sat in his room, unable to sleep. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the look in Grant's eyes, the veiled threat in his words. He knew his father was strong, but this was a battle that was bigger than any of them. The men his dad was up against weren't just bullies. They were powerful people, willing to do anything to protect their control. As the hours passed, Malik finally drifted off to sleep, but his rest was short-lived. A loud banging on the front door jolted him awake, the sound echoing through the house. He shot up, heart pounding, his mind instantly filled with dread. He heard his parents rushing down the hall, their voices tense as they moved to the front of the house. Malik crept to his bedroom door, peering out, fear twisting in his gut as he listened to the muffled voices. From his spot, he could make out the sound of unfamiliar voices, angry, demanding. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. They were here to intimidate, to threaten. Gathering his courage, Malik tiptoed down the hallway, just close enough to catch a glimpse of the front door. Standing in the doorway were two officers, their faces hard, their expressions menacing. Chief Johnson stood in front of them, his posture tense, his voice steady as he tried to defuse the situation. "This is your last warning, Chief," one of the officers said, his voice low and threatening. "You need to step down. Walk away before things get worse." Chief Johnson didn't flinch. "If you have a problem with me, there are procedures to follow. You're not above the law, and I won't let you scare me or my family out of doing what's right." The officer's face twisted in anger. "You think you're untouchable? You think these people care about you? This town isn't going to back you up when things start going south." Malik's mother stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "Get out of our home. You have no right to be here." The officers glared at her, but they didn't argue. After a tense moment, they turned and left, slamming the door behind them. Malik felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that this was far from over. As his parents locked the door, Malik approached, his voice trembling. "Dad, they're not going to stop, are they?" Chief Johnson sighed, looking at his son with a weary smile. "They're afraid, Malik. They're afraid of losing control, of being held accountable. But I'm not going to let them win. They want us to back down, to give up, but we're stronger than that." Malik nodded, feeling a surge of determination. His father was right. This fight was about more than just their family. It was about standing up against those who used fear to keep others silent, about fighting for a future where justice and fairness prevailed. As they turned off the lights and went back to bed, Malik lay awake, his heart heavy but resolute. The men who wanted to intimidate his father were powerful, but Malik knew that they couldn't break his dad's spirit. They couldn't silence the truth. But as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope. Malik's family went through their usual routines, but every time they stepped out of the house, they were met with stares, whispers, and lingering glances. Some people showed support, giving nods of encouragement, but others glared, their expressions twisted with anger and mistrust. Chief Johnson stayed focused on his work, his face a mask of calm determination. He'd arranged for more regular check-ins with his most trusted officers, the ones he knew were loyal and supportive of his efforts to reform the precinct. But the tension in the air was palpable, and everyone in the family could feel it. One evening, as the sun began to set, Malik sat at the kitchen table, finishing his homework. His mother bustled around the kitchen, preparing dinner, while his father reviewed some paperwork at the counter. It was a moment of peace, a welcome break from the chaos and fear that had consumed their lives. Then the phone rang. Chief Johnson answered, his expression growing serious as he listened. Malik watched his father's face tighten, a spark of anger and frustration flashing in his eyes. When he hung up, he turned to his wife and son, his voice steady but grim. "That was Officer Torres," he said. "There was an incident at the precinct. Someone leaked information about our upcoming reforms, and now some of the officers are staging a protest. They're demanding I resign." Malik's heart sank. The very people his father was trying to protect and serve were turning against him, resisting change in a way that felt almost personal. His father's face was a mixture of exhaustion and determination. It was clear that this was more than just a job to him. It was a calling, a mission to create a better, fairer police force. But the resistance was stronger than any of them had anticipated. Chief Johnson took a deep breath. "I'll go down there, talk to them, see if I can reason with them." His mother placed a hand on his father's arm, her face etched with worry. "Are you sure that's a good idea? They're angry. They could try something." Chief Johnson squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I have to try. This is bigger than us. If I give in now, I'm sending a message that their intimidation tactics work. And that's not the kind of legacy I want to leave." Malik felt a surge of pride, but fear lingered in the back of his mind. He knew his father was strong, but he also knew that there were limits to how much one person could withstand. Still, he didn't say anything, knowing his father had made up his mind. At the precinct, a crowd had already gathered. Off-duty officers, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, stood outside with signs and angry expressions, their voices blending into a cacophony of discontent. Malik's father stepped out of his car, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady as he walked toward the protest. Reporters lingered on the fringes, cameras flashing, capturing the scene. The city had been on edge for days, the rumors and whispers building into a frenzy. And now, with Chief Johnson facing open defiance from his own officers, the story was reaching a boiling point. As he approached, Chief Johnson raised his hands, signaling for silence. Slowly the crowd quieted, though their expressions remained hostile. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "Change is never easy, especially when it involves the very systems we rely on to keep order. But we can't ignore the truth. Our community deserves a police force they can trust, one that operates with transparency and accountability." A voice called out from the crowd, sharp and angry. "You're making us look like the bad guys, Chief. You're turning the public against us." Chief Johnson didn't flinch. My job is to serve this community. If there are bad actors among us, then it's our duty to hold them accountable. That's not turning the public against us, that's building trust." Another officer stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You don't get it, Johnson. People around here don't want your changes. They want things the way they've always been." Chief Johnson met the officer's gaze, his expression resolute. "Maybe some do. But there are many who don't, who are tired of a system that's left them feeling unsafe and unheard. Those are the people I'm here to protect." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, while others glared in defiance. The tension was thick, each side holding its ground, neither willing to back down. Malik watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding, knowing that this moment was a turning point. His father's words were strong, but he could see the division within the crowd, the lines being drawn. Just as Chief Johnson finished speaking, an officer Malik didn't recognize stepped forward, his expression cold. "You may think you're making a difference, but all you're doing is stirring up trouble. You're an outsider, and we don't want you here." Before anyone could react, the officer reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object that glinted in the evening light, a badge. He held it up, then threw it on the ground at Chief Johnson's feet, his message clear. One by one, a few other officers followed suit, tossing their badges to the ground, their faces hard, unyielding. Malik's heart sank as he watched, the rejection cutting deeper than any words could. Chief Johnson looked down at the badges, a mixture of sadness and determination in his eyes. He bent down, picked them up one by one, his hand closing tightly around the symbols of the men who'd chosen to abandon their duty. "This isn't easy for any of us," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "But I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to do what's right." The crowd dispersed slowly, some officers shaking their heads, others exchanging worried glances. The message was clear. The divide within the precinct had grown wider, the battle lines drawn. Back at home, the weight of the day hung heavy over the family. Chief Johnson was quieter than usual, his face etched with the strain of the choices he'd been forced to make. Malik wanted to say something to reassure his father, but the words escaped him. As they sat down for dinner, a sudden knock on the door shattered the silence. Malik's mother glanced at his father, worry flashing in her eyes. Chief Johnson got up, his expression worried. He opened the door to find Officer Torres standing there, looking tense and uneasy. "Chief," Torres said, his voice low, "we need to talk." Chief Johnson nodded, stepping outside with him, and Malik strained to hear their conversation. He caught snippets, words like threat and warning, each one adding to the growing sense of dread. Finally, Torres lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was watching. "There's talk that some of the officers are planning something big. They're saying it's time to take matters into their own hands. I don't know what exactly they mean, but it doesn't sound good." Chief Johnson's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "Do you know who's behind this?" Torres shook his head. "I've heard names, whispers, but nothing solid. Just be careful, Chief. They're getting desperate, and desperate people do desperate things." As Torres left, Chief Johnson returned inside, his face pale. He didn't say anything, but Malik could sense the fear and determination warring within him. That night, the family went to bed with a sense of unease, the weight of the threats hanging over them. Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the tension making it impossible to sleep. He thought about his father's words, the sacrifices he was making, and the dangers they were facing together. Then, in the dead of night, the silence was shattered. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Malik bolted upright, his heart racing as he heard his parents' footsteps rushing down the hall. He stumbled out of bed, making his way to the living room, where he found his parents standing in shock, staring at the wreckage. The window had been smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. In the center of the room lay a brick, wrapped in a piece of paper, the same jagged handwriting as before scrawled across it. This time, the message was shorter, but more menacing. "Last warning." Chief Johnson's face was grim as he picked up the brick, his expression hardening. He looked at his family, a fierce resolve in his eyes. "They want us to run," he said quietly, his voice steady, "but we're not going anywhere." Malik's mother placed a hand on his father's arm, her face a mixture of fear and pride. Malik felt the same emotions battling within him, the terror of what might come next and the pride in his father's unwavering courage. But as they cleaned up the glass and tried to settle back into an uneasy silence, Malik knew that this was far from over. The threats were escalating, and it was only a matter of time before words turned into actions. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Chief Johnson made a decision. He would go back to the precinct, confront his officers, and put an end to the threats once and for all. But as Malik watched his father prepare to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The fight for justice had reached a breaking point, and Malik feared that they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. The city had just begun to stir as Chief Johnson headed out that morning, his resolve steeling him against the storm he knew he'd have to face. Malik, still shaken from the night before, could barely eat his breakfast, worry gnawing at his insides. His mother paced the kitchen, eyes constantly darting to the clock as she waited for updates. Chief Johnson arrived at the precinct, determined to face down the hostile officers who'd made it clear that they'd do anything to drive him out. The night's threats had crossed a line, and he was prepared to confront them with every ounce of strength he had left. As he stepped inside, a heavy silence filled the room. Officers sat at their desks or leaned against the walls, each of them looking up as he entered. He could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface, the air thick with resentment and defiance. Without hesitation, Chief Johnson walked to the center of the room and cleared his throat, his voice calm but strong. "I know that some of you are unhappy with the changes we're making," he began, his gaze sweeping over the officers. "And I understand that change is hard, but what happened last night went too far. Threatening me is one thing, endangering my family is another." The officers exchanged glances, a few of them shifting uncomfortably. Others stared back at him, their expressions defiant, unapologetic. "If anyone here thinks they can intimidate me into stepping down, you're mistaken," he continued. "This isn't just about me. It's about this community, about the people who look to us for protection and justice. If you can't respect that, then maybe you're the ones who don't belong here." An angry murmur rippled through the room, some officers scoffing, others muttering under their breath. Chief Johnson stood his ground, unshaken. Then a voice spoke up from the back, loud and clear. It was Officer Brandt, his face twisted with a smug grin. "You're making a mistake, Chief," he sneered. "You think you can come in here and change everything overnight, but that's not how it works around here. We're not going to let you ruin everything we built." Chief Johnson's gaze was cold as he looked at Grant. "What exactly have you built, Grant? A system that protects a few at the expense of everyone else. That's not what law enforcement is about. If you're not willing to serve and protect every member of this community, then you have no business wearing that badge." Grant's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. "You're really willing to go down with this, aren't you?" "I'm willing to do what's right," Chief Johnson replied firmly. "And if that means standing alone, so be it." For a moment, the room fell silent. Some officers looked uncertain, caught between loyalty to their friends and a deep-seated respect for the chief's unwavering commitment to justice. But others, like Grant, remained defiant, unwilling to concede an inch. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if it weren't for the sudden sound of footsteps. Malik had arrived, having slipped out of the house to come and stand by his father's side. He stood just inside the door, his face a mixture of fear and determination, his eyes fixed on his dad. Chief Johnson looked over at his son, surprise and pride softening his expression. Malik's presence seemed to shift something in the room, a reminder that the stakes weren't just professional but personal, that this was about families, about futures, about the very heart of their community. Grant let out a derisive laugh, gesturing toward Malik. "So this is what it's come to, dragging your own son into this mess. Desperate, aren't we, Chief?" Malik clenched his fists, his face flushing with anger. But before he could respond, his father raised a hand, silencing him with a calm look. "Malik is here because he believes in what we're doing," Chief Johnson said quietly, his gaze steady on Grant. "And I'm proud of him for that. He understands what's at stake here, and he's willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I'd like to think that's something every officer in this room would respect." The tension in the room shifted again, some officers looking down ashamed, while others continued to glare. But Malik could see the wheels turning in their minds, could see them questioning their own loyalties and choices. Chief Johnson took a step closer to the group, his voice unwavering. "If anyone here believes they can't serve this community with integrity, if you're not willing to uphold the law for every citizen, regardless of who they are, then I'm asking you to leave. No hard feelings, but I can't have officers under my command who are unwilling to do their duty with honor." One by one, a few officers hesitated, then turned and walked out, their expressions a mixture of shame and defiance. Each departure left a heavier silence in their wake, the divide within the precinct becoming more visible, more undeniable. Grant remained, watching as his allies left, his face twisted with anger. Finally, he turned to Chief Johnson his voice filled with venom. "You may have won this round, Chief, but don't think for a second that you've won the war." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoing through the precinct like a final act of defiance. Back at home, Malik and his father recounted the events of the day to his mother, who listened with a mixture of relief and worry. She was proud of her husband and son, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. That night, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling as he replayed everything that had happened. He knew his father's actions were courageous, but he also knew that they'd only made more enemies in the process. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound outside, a low rumbling noise that sent a chill down his spine. He sat up, straining to listen, his heart pounding. Then came a blinding flash of light, followed by the unmistakable roar of flames. Malik scrambled to his window, his eyes widening in horror as he saw their car parked in the driveway, engulfed in fire. The flames licked up the sides, casting an eerie glow over the house. He rushed down the hall, shouting for his parents. "Mom! Dad! The car, it's on fire!" Chief Johnson bolted out of his room, followed by Malik's mother, both of them rushing to the front door. They stared in shock at the blazing inferno in their driveway, the heat radiating off the flames as they crackled and roared. Chief Johnson's face hardened, his jaw clenched as he pulled out his phone to call the fire department. But even as he spoke, Malik could see the determination in his father's eyes, a fire that burned just as fiercely as the one outside. "Who did this?" Malik's mother asked, her voice trembling with fear and anger. Chief Johnson shook his head, his voice low but steady. "I have a pretty good idea." They waited in tense silence as the fire department arrived, dousing the flames and assessing the damage. Neighbors gathered, whispering and casting worried glances, their concern palpable as they watched the destruction. By the time the fire was out, there was almost nothing left of the car, just a smoldering, blackened shell. Malik looked at his father, the gravity of the situation settling over him like heavy weight. This was no longer just about threats and intimidation. This was a full-blown assault, an attempt to drive their family out, to break his father's spirit. But as the firefighters left and the neighbors drifted back to their homes, Chief Johnson turned to his family, his expression resolute. "This isn't going to scare us off," he said quietly, his voice filled with steely determination. "They want us to give up, to back down. But we're going to keep fighting. We're going to stand our ground." Malik felt a surge of pride and fear, the two emotions warring within him as he looked at his father. The road ahead was dangerous, filled with enemies who'd do anything to protect their power. But as long as his father stood strong, Malik knew he'd stand beside him, no matter the cost. But in the quiet that followed, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something darker, something that threatened to consume everything they held dear. The stakes had been raised, and the fight for justice was about to reach its most dangerous chapter yet. The next few days felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Malik, his parents, and the community held their breath, waiting for the next strike from the officers who were so desperate to resist change. The attack on their car had left everyone on edge, but it also strengthened their resolve. Chief Johnson spent long hours at the precinct, carefully investigating every lead he could find about the officers who had turned against him. Malik's school had organized a rally in support of his father, a testament to the community's backing for the chief's efforts to bring about reform. Posters were made, and students wore blue in solidarity. The event drew a crowd, uniting people of all backgrounds, all standing together for a common cause. Malik felt a surge of hope as he spoke with classmates who admired his father's courage. They believed in the change, just as Malik did. As the day of the rally approached, the tension in the precinct grew. Chief Johnson had gathered evidence of the threats and intimidation tactics used by the rebellious officers. With Officer Torres' help, he compiled everything into a comprehensive report, ready to present it to the city council. On the morning of the rally, Malik woke up with butterflies in his stomach. His parents were up early, dressed in their best clothes. His mother looked proud, while his father wore a determined expression, ready to face whatever might come. As they arrived at the community center where the rally would take place, Malik saw that the room was packed with supporters. They were all here to show that they believed in his father and the future he envisioned for their community. As Malik stood beside his parents, listening to speeches from community leaders and his peers, he felt a warmth spreading through him. He was proud of his father, proud of the community for standing together. This was their moment to show that they would not be intimidated, that they would stand firm against the forces of hatred and division. But as the rally continued, a sense of dread crept over Malik. What if the officers retaliated? He glanced around, scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. His father, sensing his worry, put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll be okay, Malik. We're stronger together." Just then, the doors burst open, and in walked Officer Grant, flanked by several other disgruntled officers. The crowd fell silent, tension crackling in the air as everyone turned to face them. Malik's heart raced. Would they cause a scene? Would they bring violence to this peaceful gathering? Grant stepped forward, a smirk on his face that only fueled the crowd's anger. "Look at this pathetic display," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is going to change anything? You're just a bunch of sheep, following your misguided leader." Chief Johnson stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "This isn't about me, Grant. This is about justice. This is about the community wanting a police force they can trust, a police force that serves everyone." The crowd began to murmur in agreement, a ripple of support flowing through the people. Malik could see their determination hardening, their resolve solidifying against the tide of hatred. "Is that what you call this? Justice?" Grant shot back, gesturing to the crowd with disdain. "You think you can just erase everything we built? You think we're going to let you walk all over us?" With a swift motion, Chief Johnson raised his voice above the crowd. "If you can't stand for justice, if you can't protect every member of this community, then you are not fit to wear that badge. The people here deserve better." Malik watched as the tension between the two sides escalated, each word serving as a spark in the dry brush. He could feel the fear bubbling within him, but he also felt the strength of the community surrounding them, the desire for change resonating through every person gathered. Then, just as it seemed like chaos would break out, Officer Torres stepped forward, standing beside Chief Johnson. "I stand with Chief Johnson," he declared, his voice steady and clear. "And I know there are others who feel the same way. We're not afraid of change. We're afraid of what will happen if we don't change." A few more officers stepped forward, standing with Torres and Chief Johnson, ready to denounce the rebellion that had taken root within the precinct. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices lifting into the air as a wave of unity surged through them. "Let's show these officers what real strength looks like," Chief Johnson shouted, raising his hand. "We won't be intimidated." The energy in the room shifted as the supporters rallied together, chanting slogans for justice and reform. Malik felt a rush of pride as he joined in, his voice blending with the crowd, the sound reverberating through the community center. They were standing together, unified in their belief that they could make a difference. But Grant was not finished yet. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his voice laced with fury. "This is just the beginning. You'll regret this, Johnson. You'll pay for what you've done." With that, he turned and stormed out, taking the remaining Defiant officers with him. The tension hummed in the air, but the crowd was emboldened, their spirits lifted by the show of unity. After the rally concluded, Chief Johnson thanked everyone for their support, his eyes shining with determination. "Together we will bring change. Together we will create a police force that serves our community with integrity. This is just the beginning." In the following weeks, the momentum didn't wane. With the evidence collected, Chief Johnson presented his findings to the City Council. The meeting was heated, tensions high as officers loyal to Grant argued fiercely against the changes. But the weight of public support was undeniable. Citizens packed the room, demanding accountability and reform, their voices echoing the sentiments expressed during the rally. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the council voted to suspend the officers involved in the intimidation tactics and the threats against Chief Johnson's family. Grant and his allies were officially stripped of their badges, their actions condemned as a betrayal to the very people they were sworn to protect. Malik felt a rush of relief and pride wash over him. Justice had been served. But the story didn't end there. In the months that followed, Chief Johnson implemented a series of reforms within the precinct, working tirelessly to foster trust between the police and the community. He held open forums where citizens could voice their concerns, ensuring that everyone felt heard and respected. Malik's school even launched a community policing program, where students could meet officers and learn about the realities of law enforcement, bridging gaps and building relationships. As the precinct began to change for the better, Malik felt hopeful. His father's unwavering commitment to justice had not only transformed the police force, but it also ignited a fire within the community, encouraging others to take a stand against injustice. One evening, as Malik and his parents sat together in their living room, watching a news report on the ongoing reforms, Malik turned to his father. "You did it, Dad," he said, a proud smile spreading across his face. "You changed everything." Chief Johnson smiled back, his eyes filled with warmth. "No, Malik, we get it. This was a team effort. The community stood together, and that's what made all the difference." Malik felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him, knowing that their fight had not been in vain. They had faced darkness and emerged stronger together. But just as they began to relax, a knock at the door interrupted their moment. Malik exchanged a nervous glance with his parents as his father got up to answer it. Standing at the door was Officer Torres, a wide smile on his face. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you. I couldn't have done this without your family's support. Because of you, we're building a better police force, one that truly serves our community." Chief Johnson shook his hand, gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you, Torres. It takes courage to stand up for what's right, and I'm proud of you for doing so." As they stood together, Malik felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and obstacles, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. The family gathered in the living room, grateful for the support and love that had brought them through the darkest days. They knew they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone in their community. Justice had prevailed, and the fight for a better future continued, stronger than ever before. Together, they would create a legacy of hope, courage, and resilience that would shine brightly for generations to come.